Upon reviewing a book written by journalist and Catholic convert G.K. Chesterton, the fashionable novelist Arnold Bennett offered a sidelong comment implying that anyone who subscribed to a dogma, like Catholicism, was of second rate intelligence. Not only did Chesterton prove Bennett wrong in the 20th century, but Joshua Hren proves him wrong in the 21st. Joshua Hren on literature and the Catholic sensibility now. My name is Todd Warner, and this is the Evangelization and Culture podcast from Word on Fire. Joshua Hren is founder of Wisebud Books and co-founder of the Masters of the Fine Arts program at the University of St. Thomas in Houston. He regularly publishes essays and poems in such journals as the Los Angeles Review of Books and First Things, America and National Review, Commonweal and Public Discourse, The European Conservative, and The Lamp. Joshua's books include the novel Infinite Regress, the short story collections This Our Exile and In the Winepress, the book of poems Last Things, First Things, and Other Lost Causes, Middle Earth and the Return of the Common Good, J.R.R. Tolkien and Political Philosophy, How to Read and Write Like a Catholic, and finally, Contemplative Realism, a theological, aesthetical manifesto. Joshua, it is great to talk with you.
Oh, it's a total joy to be here with you, Todd. Thank you so much.
Segment 1, Meeting Joshua Hren. So Joshua, you were born in and lived a good portion of your life in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. You've called it, quote, a city that is gritty, a city of tensions that stirred my moral imagination at a young age, end quote. Can you tell me a little bit about this?
Sure. So I was born and raised in Milwaukee and lived in the heart of the city for much of my youth and really tried to stay here for the entirety of my life and ended up leaving at age 33 to become an itinerant professor for a while before my present position, which is a kind of post-COVID job at the University of St. Thomas in Houston, while also running the MFA there from a distance, allowed me to come back. And so it's been a tremendous blessing to be back home here. I would say that there are a number of things in my childhood that stirred the moral imagination. One of them was my Uncle Tom Sanfilippo reading J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings to my cousins and I, having us sit on his lap or next to him, and he would just have us sort of spellbound, gathered there. And I did not grow up in a household where there was a great deal of reading. So these kind of entrees or invitations into the life of the imagination and life of the mind that came from outside were hugely providential and important.
Yeah.
My my parents actually once came upon me working on a novel when I was in fourth grade. I was writing my first 96-page imitation of The Lord of the Rings, and it's probably the best thing that I've ever written, but unfortunately it's lost
to history,
to posterity. Yeah. And you have just the sort of sound and fury signifying nothing that I'm putting out now, but I remember distinctly that they came in to the basement and I was sitting there writing this novel, and they said that we need you to really come back to reality. We need you to go outside, and we're really worried about you, that you are losing touch with reality. And then many years later, I read the scene in Cervantes' Don Quixote where Don Quixote's friends are worried about him because he's spending too much time with his books, and they actually start burning them. And I read that with great recognition. God bless my parents. I'm sure that they were right. There's the interesting thing about the life of the mind and the imagination is that it can both provide a kind of interior deepening that allows you to go outside with greater profundity, and it can sometimes lead to a solipsism or an escapism or a kind of turning too much inward, so that, as St. Augustine said in his Confessions, the things that you see in fantasy actually become more important to you than the things that are actually happening in your life. Right. So think about someone who cares more about the characters on a sitcom than they do about their own moral quandaries. Right. They're more eager to return to those Netflix series, for example, than they are to their own need to undergo conversion, for example, right? So
And kind of a little bit also like the budding metaverse. I mean, a little bit of let's live as an avatar or what have you, as opposed to living in the here and now. Let's escape and be somebody that is kind of crafted and fictional and presenting nothing but my best sides that I want everybody to see, and not having just that kind of gritty, kind of elbow rubbing, flesh, pressing the flesh with people. It sounds almost like you say, my parents were kind of telling me, "Hey, yeah, you've got to pull back and kind of come back to reality." And you're looking at this and saying, they didn't stifle me; they actually kind of helped curb me and keep my feet on the ground while my head was still appropriately in the clouds, so to speak. Is that? I mean,
I, I
do you look at their advice as being, in retrospect, it wasn't like don't write, don't read, don't live the
no.
life of the imagination. It was saying, "Son, you've got to live in both worlds." Is that? Would you say that?
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know that I received it as such
Yeah,
as
of
a
course.
young boy or young man.
Yeah.
And in fact, I have a strong contrarian streak that the sacraments have been able to correct to a mild degree over 40 years, 42 years now. But probably actually what happened was at the time is that they said, don't do this. So then I did it even more
Very good
and
one.
became
Good
even
one.
more committed to writing. And so, when I barely graduated high school, I got a P, not even a D minus, but a P in my physical education class, and all I had to do was a step aerobics routine at this public high school to Total Eclipse of the Heart, and I couldn't even barely get that together in time. So
Oh
I
my.
barely graduated high school, and then I didn't think college was for me. This was kind of before everyone was going to college.
Yeah.
And I think obviously we're seeing a correction and probably will return to a time where not everyone feels compelled or obliged to go.
Yeah.
But this was right on the cusp of that. And so I initially just took some time away from college, 4 years. I didn't even think of it as a quote gap year or something. It was just, I'm never going to go.
Mm.
And I worked at a paper factory, waited tables, and wrote and wrote and wrote and wrote. And there was a kind of real zeal and drivenness that I think, I can trace back to that fourth grade experience of really being almost compelled by something outside of myself to write.
What I love about this, a couple things. I mean, my humor is going to say, there's a Tolstoy slash Dostoevsky like 96-page work of yours that will be discovered sometime in the attic years from now, and will be the classic that eclipses all other classics of yours, that written from the hand of a fourth grader. The second thing is, I hope there is hidden video of you doing a step aerobic routine to Total Eclipse of the Art that also emerges, that just shows you in a completely different light. So we can only hope that these things will emerge in the future. I want to speak a little bit on a more serious note. Before graduating from high school, you would. My understanding is there's some plans to maybe become a carpenter or a nurse, and some of these plans, were derailed. You began to write poetry and found yourself spending hours in a coffee shop amongst a literary crew engaged in poetry reading. I think you called it, quote, your liturgy at a time when you had left the church, end quote. My
Mhm,
question for you is, as you found, maybe tell us a little bit about finding your way to that
mhm,
environment, and secondly,
mhm.
how were you formed by that environment?
Sure. So I think literature as a whole is a kind of war against oversimplification
Hmm.
and a war against cliche. It is a war against our attempts to reduce people to caricatures or to kind of minuscule explanations that don't do justice to reality. And I think that as a young man, I encountered a lot of that kind of oversimplification. And so meeting these poets in the coffee shop was a revelation and a
Hmm.
discovery of that kind of achievement of depth and a commitment to it. And there was a authenticity to their commitment that was stunning. And especially at a time when I had left the church, this was definitely satisfying that liturgical need that I think all human beings are, Homo sapiens, but also Homo religiosus, right? We're
Hmm.
intrinsically religious as a people. And so we have to fulfill it in one way or another. And this
Yeah.
was a pretty darn good liturgy out in terms of what you can find outside of true religion. It
Yeah.
obviously had all kinds of flaws, and it ultimately became an idol, and an obstacle, I think, to my pursuit of God and pursuit of truth. But at the time, I remember, you know, talking to some of these poets who would gather every Sunday, and it wouldn't just be for 45 minutes, it would be
Mm.
for hours. We would go on for hours and hours, sometimes 3 or 4 hours, as long as it took. People would get up, read their own poetry, recite poems from memory, play music. And the atmosphere was one of great intensity and sincerity. Also, I came to understand as life went on that the ethic of sincerity is not sufficient,
Yeah.
because you can be a sincere person and pursue error with great
Yeah.
sincerity.
Yeah. Yeah.
But at the time, again, looking around and seeing what I perceived as a lot of kind of phoniness and hypocrisy, this encounter with that level of sincerity and commitment was hugely influential. And I remember, being uh, being inclined to think that because they were artists, for example, they would be interested in drinking heavily. So I remember, I was a young man. I don't even think I was 21. I think I drank more before I was 21 than I did afterwards. Thanks be to
Sure.
God, I developed an alcohol allergy at age 21, which probably saved me, from going down a really bad path. But I remember, saying, "Oh, let's go drink this 6 pack or something they had in my backpack." And these poets were sort of like, "What are you talking about? We're committed to the art, right?
Mm.
We're not that. I'm not interested in that." And in fact, one of the guys called this really cheap Milwaukee beer a brain grenade, and it left a really deep impression, right? Because I thought, okay, there's something that they're after, and the discipline and the order that they've been
Yeah.
able to achieve is attractive. And, one of them, for example, went down to New Mexico in the summers, dug ditches, and made a lot of money so that he could come back for the rest of the year and just live in a really cheap Milwaukee neighborhood and write.
Mm.
So that, yeah, that was all. I think, again, a hugely important revelation or explosion of this world of literature that is a war against oversimplification, and on a natural level deepen my understanding of human reality. But then in religious terms, it was not leading me any closer to the Lord, to God, and that had to come through another means.
It is interesting, the whole notion of Augustine's restless heart, that sometimes the heart does kind of seemingly rest for a time in something that is not God and ultimately becomes restless all over again. And it's interesting because sometimes I imagine in these kind of literary circles there might have been disdain for God or what have you, and yet there is a very clear sense of wishing for and yearning for the eternal, for the transcendent, and yet not never quite landing on it. So that's an extraordinary testimony you just gave.
Yeah, to return to the opening remarks that you made about dogma and intelligence, or dogma and art, I think that what I would describe this artistic community as, and this actually obtains, I think, to a lot of literary culture in our time, is that they weren't necessarily anti-religious or atheistic. In fact, I think that most artists, in one way or another, are open to spiritual realities.
Mm.
But the idea that you could proclaim that one of those spiritual truths is greater than another is where we would always meet the rub, right? So it was
Yeah.
fine if you're Allen Ginsberg writing beat poetry and writing howl, and you're sort of celebrating all religious traditions at the same time, so that not one is elevated above another. Fine, fine. But if you were to come in and say, definitively, um, he who holds he who hates his brother in his heart is a murderer, right? To cite scripture, and that is absolutely true, then the doors close.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
or right when religion starts making a real demand on your life, I think is where, in these literary circles, oftentimes there's a resistance,
Yeah.
because there's a pursuit of kind of aesthetic pleasure, and
Hmm.
that it is really satisfying. It's, as you said, Augustine found out that it's not ultimately satisfying, but it goes a long way, and so people don't want to let go of that aesthetic sort of pleasure as the driving force of their life.
Yeah. In an anecdote that contains echoes of Winston Churchill's ghostwriting English papers for his friend in high school, you penned a story for your college girlfriend's English class What did the professor say when he read what he thought was your girlfriend's paper, and how did that impact you?
Yeah, so that was little bit later. At that time, I had returned to the faith actually through a coworker where I was waiting tables, and he was winning all of these arguments about transubstantiation. He was a Catholic and had a young family, and I didn't want him to know that he was winning, but I was sneaking off to mass on Sunday and
Mm,
was having these really inexplicable, potentially mystical experiences where I would lose consciousness during the consecration, or what I can only describe as lose consciousness,
mm,
and I would wake or shake out of it with a sense of great peace. And so it was around this time that I was dating this woman who was in college. I was not, and she had submitted a short story that I wrote called "A Raindrop Needs Rain," I think, to the professor, and she'd asked me just on a whim to write it for her the night before. She typed it up, and he said that this was the best thing that anyone had turned in his
mm.
class and forever, basically. And I think I'm bad at a lot of things in life. You can ask my wife and children. You can ask my confessor, but I think that I am good as with language, with just
Yeah,
piecing words together, and I think that was a talent that I was sort of zealously driven towards, as I was describing to you, but I did not have a recognition or confirmation that it was a real talent and that it wasn't just a sort of faux kind of, fake artistic pursuit where I was just striving after the fulfillment of my ego of getting something
sure.
published. But that helped me to recognize that it was a genuine talent and gift that needed to be cultivated. And so that's what I did.
Segment two, the writer. Flannery O'Connor once insisted, quote, "Everywhere I go, I'm asked if I think universities stifle writers. I think they don't stifle enough of them. The kind of writing that can be taught is the kind you then have to teach people not to read," end quote. So, Joshua, you've completed your PhD, if I remember correctly, religious literature, political philosophy, and literature, and fiction writing, if I'm not mistaken.
That's
Um,
correct. Yes.
so obviously an extraordinary accomplishments and incredible amount of knowledge. You've been taught all about writing. So as a person who comes out of a program that trains in great literature but also great writing, I've just read Flannery's perspective. Is Flannery being too harsh, and tell me why or why not?
Yeah, I mean, as with many of her remarks, I think she's going for the jugular,
Yeah,
and I don't know how seriously we can take her if we sort of tease that out to its logical extension. I mean, Flannery O'Connor went to the Iowa Writers Workshop
yeah,
herself, and I think that if she hadn't, she would be a far lesser writer. I don't
right.
even know whether we would be reading her now. Maybe we would, because she went on to find other literary mentors like Carolyn Gordon,
Mhm.
the Catholic convert, and Carolyn Gordon's influence could have served what the MFA served in her life. But I think that the truth is that she's onto obviously something when she says
Yeah,
that if you learn how to write badly enough, you can put out a bestseller.
right.
My wife actually just said to me last night, "What do you think of this book?" And she held it up. I won't say what book it is. I said, "I actually think it's overrated and it's really not what everybody says it is." And she said, "Well, but it says here on the back, New York Times bestseller." And I said, my response was, "Well,
Exactly.
what is the main thing that, people use the internet for? Pornography, right? So does
Good
that mean
one.
that
Good
because
one.
it's this thing that everyone goes after, right? That
Yeah.
therefore it is good." And we all know that that's, and obviously my wife knows better than I, that that's not the case, right? So, but we can be kind of duped momentarily
Yeah.
into these approvals as if they're imprimaturs or sort of magisterial
Yeah.
declarations of the
Yeah.
goodness of something. Um, so I think that the risk of studying literature in an institutional setting is that it can be reduced to a kind of democratic committee process
Hmm.
where a workshop where everybody's getting together, they've read your story, they've read a peer story, and they've commented and marked it up, and then the author is sitting there sort of receiving all of these critiques and feels overwhelmed because they say, well, what am I supposed to do? Implement all of these suggestions?
Yeah.
And I always joke with my students, can you imagine what the story would look like if you simultaneously did what everyone said things should be done with the story? It would be
Yeah.
pulled in about 20 directions,
Right.
and it would be an awful piece of literature. But it is also the case that within that larger group of students of maybe 12 or 13, you have two or three who really understand what you're doing.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, you have the professor. And between that, I think you can glean a lot in terms of what is really not working well in your story. And the suggestions that your peer and your professor give might not be the right ones
Mm-hmm.
in terms of how you should revise, but they probably are onto something when they say that this is wrong or missing or this dialogue is flat and it
Yeah.
needs to be rewritten, right?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, great. That's great. And it was funny because I was thinking about you as a mentor, because obviously, as a co-founder of the program down at the University of St. Thomas in Houston, you're giving a lot of advice and insight and guidance to people. And there, it strikes me that I would imagine that, because obviously we know that we, as a writer myself, but and many other people who are writing, we all can have a touch of the ego and a touch of sharp elbows and so on and so forth. It seems to be that the mentoring of young writers has to begin a little bit with the willing the good of the other. I mean, recognizing that this person is undergoing a process, they have an inspiration, and that you're earnestly not trying to just red mark everything because you want to show how smart you are, or you know what your tastes are, they're different than theirs, and therefore you're right, they're wrong. But at the same time, you also have all this wisdom to impart in striking that balance, that tension between the wisdom you have and and the free voice that they have. Yeah, it takes a gift like yours to be able to do that. Is that a fair way of saying it?
oh, it's a great characterization of exactly what's going on. There's a vulnerability, and yet that vulnerability, if it's weathered well, is it results in one of the greatest gifts, which is the ability to see the thing that you're working on as if from someone else's vantage point,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
And so, for example, a lot of my students, and we have to kind of go through this together. When they first start out in the MFA, they feel really defeated after the first workshop, right? Maybe I'm not supposed to be a writer. I should probably just go back to whatever I was doing and realize
mm,
that this was a midlife crisis or something like that, right? But then, the truth is that it's just simply the case that prior to that, when they were showing their story to friends and family, these people were not equipped to offer them a sort
mm,
of legitimate and accurate response. And so they either said, "Oh, that's great," but they didn't actually know what was going on, or they said,
yeah,
"Oh, I'm not really interested in literature." And so it's the experience of having someone. It feels like someone's kind of ripping out your soul, right? I
yeah,
mean,
yeah,
Francois Mauriac, the great French Catholic writer, said that to write is to hand oneself over, right? And so
mm,
even if you're not writing something autobiographical, there's a way in which something that you've struggled with, or that you've seen someone dear to you struggle with, or that is at stake in your mind and heart, is going to be put onto the page. And so you're going to oftentimes at first feel as though someone's chopping apart your heart. And what
yeah,
you need to do is get to a point where you see that they're simply responding to your art, not your heart, right?
yeah,
So,
yeah, yeah. That's well said. I always like Joshua. I like to know from great writers what their habits are. Do you have a routine for writing? What does it look like for you to write in any given day?
yeah, so I do not, just like the Pharisees, I do not do what I say should be done. um, and especially right now, and this is a strange time in life in that Wisebud Books is really flourishing, and I know we'll touch on that a little bit.
Yeah.
But I'm working kind of two near full-time jobs, and so I'm not really able to write with any kind of regularity. But I advise my students that they should write at least 150 words a day,
Mm,
and they should, if they can't do that, then revise 150 words a
mm,
day, right? So it's not always a matter of needing to have some sort of breakthrough with the muses where you produce something that wasn't there before. Sometimes it's just a matter of revisiting. So I am mainly writing at this point in kind of fits and starts over maybe a long weekend, And then during weeks in the summer, I am about 62,000 words into the next novel.
Great.
So I've not done nothing, but it's slow in coming because out of all of the other kind of duties and obligations that I have, writing is the one I would say that I would love to be doing
Yeah.
first and
Yeah.
foremost the most, but it always has to be the thing that I do last. Just right now, that just happens to be what it's like.
Season of life, and obviously you have young kids, and it's
Hmm.
just, there's, again, you're pulled into many, many different directions. I was going to make a comment, and we'll get into it when we talk about wise blood, but about when do you sleep, but that's I know that's a whole nother set of questions here. I want to ask you, I know that you have great facility in writing in all different forms. I mean, you long form essays, short story collections, poems, not a novel, another novel on the way. What do you prefer? I mean, and I'm not trying to ask you which is your favorite child, and maybe you're going to look at it that way, and maybe you're going to say it's in the season when I can write short stuff. I have to write short stuff when I have longer, the greater amount of time. I write the novel. What if you had your way of things? Would it be the variety, or would you sink your teeth into one form of writing or the other?
Yeah, I absolutely love the novel as a
Mm,
form. And so
mm,
it is so expansive. It can absorb so many different genres and so many different voices and sort of sub pursuits of other things. You know, the essay can be woven into the novel. The short story can be woven into the novel in terms of, smaller stories within the larger story. You can reach really high for sort of elevated insight with certain characters, and then you can maintain a kind of middle brow level with other characters, that reflects sort of their capacity. And so the novel is the form that I would really love to work in more and plan to, insofar as I am able to write going forward, to really focus primarily on that. There was a time when I was mainly committed to writing academic essays
mm,
and submitting them to peer-reviewed journals. This was after I had worked as a chaplain to the homeless with some Franciscans in Milwaukee for a few years and tried to avoid the fate of academia.
mm,
And I would come home from working with the homeless, which was incredibly blessed work, to feeling kind of a certain malnourishment intellectually. And so
mhm,
I think when I went into graduate school, then the fact that there were other people who took these big ideas and big questions seriously, um, I was so grateful for that I became kind of smitten with it. And then I
yeah,
was writing all of these academic essays. But over time, what I came to realize is that, nobody reads academic essays except
mm.
for, I think there are literally studies that have shown that it's three people maybe that read each academic article on average. And
Sorry,
one of them is,
all of you academic writers out there. I'm sorry.
well, I'm going to come swing back and sort of have some nice things to say in a moment. But and one of those three people is the author, and the other
Good
is
one.
is the editor. And then, right. So, and there are exceptions to this, obviously, right? Um, but then, so then I started writing in a more popular mode, and it actually took a good year or three to break out of that kind of academic jargon and
Mm,
to get to a point where I could write something that my mom would be able to engage with without being bored to death, right? Because
yeah.
it doesn't have heavy philosophical or jargon, what would be perceived as maybe jargon-ish language. Um, but then I came to also understand, in swinging to the other end of the pendulum, that some of that popular writing was losing its depth, right? So that
Mm,
there is there's a great passage in Moby Dick where I think it's Ishmael makes a remark about popularizing profundity, that you
mm,
cannot popularize profundity and all truth is profound, is what
yeah.
Ishmael
Wow.
says. And there's a way in which obviously it's good to strive to write in a middle brow way that as many people as possible can understand. A literary work, for example, that previously has left them scratching their head. They say, why should we read Flannery O'Connor? Why should we read Bernanos? These people are, pathologically insane or something like that, right? Why are
Yeah.
they so
Yeah.
focused on suffering and pain and chaos? And then you would it's good to try to make the case for that. But in so doing and trying to reach the largest possible audience, you also limit the amount of the you limit the deep dive, right?
Yeah.
You can't really go down. And Flannery O'Connor says the same thing, right? Art and democracy are sort of at a certain point have to part ways.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, it's interesting you say that because I will say my coming into the Catholic faith was I was haunted by Bernard No, by O'Connor, and by some of the dark humor work of Waugh, um, in part because it was so jarring, it was so off-putting. It dragged me into the depths, and to some extent in a odd and maybe delicious way. I kind of wanted to be there because it
yeah.
sort of it kind of it pulled me away from the
Mm.
superficialities, or as you were just saying, the oversimplifications and so on. And again, whether you're a young child sitting in the lap of your uncle listening to the Lord of the Rings, or you're a teenager watching the Star Wars trilogy, or what have you, we or an older person reading the Iliad, we all hunger for an epic story that dives deep and speaks and touches the soul, and challenges us to sometimes put the book down, walk away, puzzle over it, maybe not get it, maybe never quite get it, but
Sure.
to be consistently intrigued by the mystery of the depths, which you can't fully see, but you can't stop looking at it.
Yeah, absolutely. Throw the book across the room one day.
Right.
Then you try to go to sleep. You can't sleep. You say, "Wait a minute, why did I throw that across the room?" Right? What was it about that character that was driving me crazy that actually reveals something about my own weaknesses, for example, or what is it about that character whose aspirations struck me as sort of over the top that actually was awakening a good desire in me that I had put to sleep 10 years ago and that I should be bringing back, right? So,
Yeah. Well said. Well said. Hi, I'm Todd Warner, managing editor of Evangelization and Culture, the journal of the Word on Fire Institute. Word on Fire is a global evangelical community that exists to provide our members with the resources they need to proclaim Christ to a secular culture. Our award-winning quarterly journal, Evangelization and Culture, is offered exclusively to Word on Fire Institute members. It's a tangible representation of our mission and goal to lead with beauty in order to bring others to the knowledge of truth. Inside each issue, you'll find writing from premier scholars and inspiring pieces on literature, culture, and daily life from fellow missionaries on the journey to know and serve Christ. Get a copy of the current issue of the Evangelization and Culture Journal for free by visiting wordonfire.org/journal. Thank you, and join us in bringing Christ to a hungry culture. Segment 3, Wise Blood Books. If one were to visit the website for Wise Blood Books and read the first sentence of your masthead, here is what they would encounter. Quote, "Our dock serves as harbor to diverse vessels of literature, minimalist or stream of consciousness, philosophical thriller or epistolary novel, vampire detective fiction or great works in fresh translation, collection of vignettes or thousand-page opus, formalist poetry or political memoir." So, Joshua, tell me about Wise Blood Books and why did you decide to embark on this endeavor?
yeah, thank you so much for asking. So, I think you can glean from that description that what we're striving after is a kind of small C Catholicity. There's no type of writing or style of writing that we would not be interested in.
Mhm.
And yet we're also very much a press founded in the capital C Catholic literary tradition. So about 10 years ago, in 2013, Dana Joya wrote the essay, The Catholic. Um, sorry, why am I blanking on it? Sorry,
The
probably
Catholic Writer
references.
Today, I think.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I've talked about it so many times.
yeah.
So in 2013, he wrote The Catholic Writer Today, published it in First Things, and I had founded Wiseblood a few months before that essay appeared. And in that essay, he says, if the state of contemporary Catholic literary culture can best be conveyed by the image of a crumbling old immigrant neighborhood, then let me suggest that it is time for Catholic writers and intellectuals to leave the homogeneous, characterless suburbs of the imagination and move back to the big city, where we can renovate these remarkable districts that have such grace and personality, such strength and tradition.
Mm.
Starting the renovation may seem like hard work, but as soon as one place is rebuilt, someone else will already be at work next door. And this is hard work, but what a small price to pay to have
Mm.
the right home. And so, in a way, I had just finished my PhD in a deeply secular State University, and there were obviously a lot of good professors who opened me up to amazing questions and ideas. But there was also a real resistance and allergy to, again, kind of definitive religious truths. And so it was at that time that I was also editing a couple of different Catholic and Christian literary magazines and encountering submissions that were really remarkable, definitely publishable work. But the same refrain kept coming across my desk, which is when I take this story to the New York publishing industry, nobody's really interested in it. Like, agents are dismissing it left and right. And, there's always a risk when someone sort of is a Christian to say, oh, New York, or let's say Hollywood, is not interested in my project because I'm a Christian. But the truth is that it's just bad art, for example, right?
Yeah.
Or the truth is that I'm just not a good writer. I'm not a good
Right.
thinker, but I'm going to
Right.
sort of play the victim and speak out of resentment, right? But in these cases, these works were actually really good. And so I had also at this time sent out about 100 applications for academic jobs, was not getting anything back. And so started to think in a more unconventional way about other paths. I came back from a barista interview and was told that I was overqualified. And in the midst of all of that, which, if they know anything about the state of PhDs and inflation value of PhDs right now, anyone could get a PhD. So like, they had no idea what they're talking about, right? But so, I mean, for goodness sake, I just got tenure last week. That should tell you something. Like, if they're giving it out to me, but right. So, and I'm sorry, I'm not. That is genuinely not false humility, because it is amazing. Like, I'll never forget that. I think it was about 10 years ago, I came across this translation of Sophocles' plays. And in the frontispiece of the book, in very large letters, the translator had declared that he had his master's degree, right? And it was a big deal. And
Yeah.
and so here's someone who is translating Sophocles with a master's degree versus right. So
Yeah.
at any rate, so I had two children at the time. We were living in a kind of rough neighborhood of Milwaukee. But that also meant the rent was cheap and cost of living was cheap, and so we could take some risks. I don't know that I would do this again if I was myself now with four children. And yet at the time, I decided to start trying to publish books. And part of that process involved bringing classics back into print.
Yeah.
So everyone knows that Amazon, and all these other companies have generated print-on-demand books. And you order the book, and let's say it's a copy of Pride and Prejudice, and it'll show up with 3-point font, and the whole novel is 50 pages long. And you're
terrible.
like, well, where's the beauty? And there's
Yes.
no order. And it's obviously just this sort of machine that things are getting pumped through. So I tried to find books like that where the public domain version or the available version was produced poorly, and tried to do it more beautifully. And that was just also to learn how to make books, to learn how to typeset. And all of this was just by ear from scratch. I did contact other publishers and editors to serve as an apprentice. But it was really a sort of garage operation run out of a room in our apartment. And then at the same time, I started to publish some of these works that I was describing that I came across by contemporary writers, collections of poems, novels, short story collections by typically Catholic or Christian writers with a Catholic or Christian vision. And I think that the press probably would have existed for another 2 or 3 years and then floundered. But at that time, as I mentioned earlier, Dana Gioia published The Catholic Writer Today. And First Things and I wrote a 14-page letter in response to him, kind of taking issue with different things that he was contending. His main argument was that, yes, we have these sort of subculture of a subculture, Christian and Catholic literary movements, but we lack anyone of the stature of someone like Flannery O'Connor. There's no one at from a bird's eye view at the national level of literary culture. There's no sort of serious Catholic writing today, right? There are people who are embarrassed about their Catholicism. There are people who write in hatred of their Catholicism, or sort of do a cafeteria sort of soft style Catholicism, but there's no serious Catholics. And so I wrote a response to him. He very generously wrote back, and within about a week, we were fast friends. And he
Mm,
also donated an extended version of The Catholic Writer Today to Wiseblood Books to publish in as a monograph. And
amazing.
we made a beautiful version of that book and sent it out to thousands of people all over the country. And that was what really allowed Wiseblood to gain that kind of visibility that it lacked. And I think without that instance, we would not exist now. Now, I mean, we are, I think, one of the most reputable literary presses in the country.
Yeah.
Um, I hope I can say that not just in
Yes.
terms of the
Yes.
Catholic literary milieu, but just per se. And part of the reason for that is because Catholic literary culture, excuse me, most literary culture has been taken over by an extreme form of identity politics, where it's right, like you submit to this contest only if you have this sexual
Yeah.
orientation.
Yeah.
If you don't have this sexual orientation, we don't publish books like that here. If you don't have this skin color, we don't publish your books here. That's literally the state of literary culture in our time. And so it's actually, a very Catholic thing to eschew that and to
Yeah.
say, open, here comes everybody instead. And so, right, our standards have increased dramatically since we first started, and I'm very, very grateful, very, very proud of the work that we're doing right now.
I want to just again to your back to your masthead for a second. It's amazing what you've done. I mean, the array of books. I mean, there's of production you have, monographs and poetry collections, fiction, nonfiction, classic, contemporary. And you mentioned Dana Gioia. You have Sally Thomas, James Matthew Wilson, Katie Carl, plus the classic works of Bernano, Raisa Martin, even Yeats. What I love about this story also is the notion, like you said, there's people out there that write and they don't write well, but then they come and say to you, here, you should publish this because I'm being persecuted by the big press, companies and so on. And you're like, well, this may not be for us, this may not be the quality. But then there's others that you say it's kind of stunning this is being turned away. And it's like you recognize that there's this niche, if you will, that is totally untapped, that speaks with a Catholic sensibility, that dives deep, that challenges prevailing kind of public norms, public ideology, and so on and so forth. And it seems like, yes, with the aid of God, the Holy Spirit, Dana Joya's, kind of helping push things in the right direction, and your earnest, sleepless endeavor. Are you surprised at the success you've encountered? Are you surprised by the reception of your readership, that there is actually a market for what you have since produced?
I would say both yes and no. And actually, it's interesting that you asked that question because, in a way, I think that we still have a readership to find.
Mm,
It's not that we haven't found a readership. We actually our book sales this year have doubled compared to previous years. So
wow.
it's obviously tapping into, at a time when the amount of people who are reading is declining. The fact that our book sales are doubling is something, right, to pay attention to. But it's also the case that I think that, right, we need to move. Okay, how can I best put this? 10 years ago, when Dana wrote that essay, the state of Catholic literary culture was like an abandoned immigrant neighborhood. We have
Mm,
now gone back into that immigrant neighborhood, and we have occupied it. We have refurbished it. It is an incredible immigrant neighborhood right now.
mm,
And to some extent, to extend the metaphor, it's the work that we've done and the books that we've brought into being are being read by people outside of that immigrant neighborhood, right? So we at the one of the things that grew out of Dana's essay is a biannual Catholic Literary Imagination Conference,
mm,
and we have seen the speakers who are interested in coming to this biannual conference, shift significantly. So, for example, last year, Christopher Beha, who's the editor of Harper's, was one of the keynote speakers. Phil Clay, who won the National Book Award, right, was one of the major readers. These are people who, I guess you could say, don't really need the Catholic literary
yeah.
milieu. They don't need Catholic literary culture. They could go do readings in New York and have a sold out house every time they do it, right? But there's something about the kinds of readings that they receive from people in the Catholic literary community that are attentive to the spiritual, that maybe they're not seeing in some of the reviews that appear in New York Review of Books
Yeah.
that I think is really attractive to them. But right, so there is some crossover, and there's significantly more reach in terms of our readership beyond the Catholic ghetto, so to speak, or the Catholic immigrant neighborhood than there was 10 years ago. But I still think that there's more work to be done. So I think of, for example, the amazing work that Well Read Moms has
Mm.
done in terms of sort of cultivating a great book's sensibility among people who would normally have taken their reading cues from Oprah,
Yeah.
and instead are now getting a much more Catholic sort of sensibility behind the books that they're reading. And I think that what the next step for all of us involved in Catholic literature needs to be is doing something like what the Well Read Moms have done to get these books. The books are there. The amazing contemporary Catholic novels are either written or are being written or will be written in the next few years. But there's still more to be done in terms of finding that readership.
Segment 4: The Catholic and the Novelist. Flannery O'Connor, once again, was always skittish about being called a Catholic novelist. Wise Blood publications are not necessarily Catholic works, but are works informed by a deep Catholic sensibility. Joshua, is that a fair assessment for me to say that?
Oh yeah, definitely. And I think that, right, it seems like the O'Connor reluctance, and you have that same reluctance with other writers like Francois Mauriac. Bernanos, actually, not so much.
Yeah.
He was very much kind of willing to embrace it. And he was a reactionary man through and through.
Yeah.
And so that kind of
Yeah.
makes sense. But I think that it's partially just a rhetorical rejection. It's not that Mauriac or Flannery O'Connor, right, if their faith was put to the test or they were publicly
Sure.
questioned, would deny the faith. I think that what they were reluctant to have happen is that if they were pegged as a sort of Catholic novelist, then that means that they would be given a separate section at Barnes and Noble,
Yeah. Yeah.
where there's this little sort of subtitle of a subtitle of a subtitle called Catholic literature, and nobody who's not Catholic would be interested in reading it. And obviously, they were writing for everyone, not just for their fellow Catholics. And so, yeah, I guess that's how I would describe that breakdown. I do think that the in the beginning of the press, I tried to really be careful rhetorically about emphasizing the capital C Catholic aspect of what we were doing.
Yeah.
And what I found is that that was actually harmful to our growth. And so for a time, it was better to expressly pronounce ourselves as a Catholic, capital C, literary press. And we found more readers that way. And now I'm actually kind of doing, again, something along the lines of the reverse to, the kinds of writers who are publishing are not necessarily capital C Catholic, and sometimes they are, but I think that their work could reach a much broader audience. So yeah, it's a delicate dance, and there's always the interplay between rhetoric and truth at work.
Well, and I think it's to your point. I think probably as you've been educated, but also as you're educating it at the University of St. Thomas, is the notion that absolutely the Catholic sensibility can and should be informing our writers who are called to write in that fashion. But the first and foremost thing is, I imagine for the Catholic literary renaissance, you first want to have a literary renaissance of great writing. It's got to be across the board. A novelist is a good novelist because a novelist is a good
Absolutely.
novelist.
That's exactly right.
And so it's not like, well, oh, but he's good as a Catholic. He's good. He's good. He's the best of the Catholics. But that's kind of a backhanded compliment. Really, toe to toe with everybody else out there that's a novelist. What do you expect? He's a Catholic. And I think that was the rip, as we were talking about, that Chesterton got leveled with. And of course, Chesterton, the great end of that line was, there are effectively saying there are two people in the world: those who have a dogma and know it, those who have a dogma and don't know it. I'm fortunate to belong to the former, and my friend here belongs to the latter, and so on. So I think the great call to say, be excellent at your art, and let Catholic sensibility inform your art if you're called in that way. Is that a fair way of saying it?
That is excellently put and absolutely true. And so let's do a test, for example, right? Was Chesterton a good novelist? I'm not quite so sure. He was
Right.
a decent novelist, actually.
Right.
He himself said, after he
Yeah.
wrote The Return of Don Quixote, I think, that was the novel that cured him of writing novels, because he realized that he was an essayist. And I think that anyone who's honest about that assessment of his artistic capacity would say yes and nod in assent. But there can be a kind of fetishization, right, of someone
Yeah.
like Chesterton in Catholic circles, and so it can be like, he can do no wrong. He was a devout man. He wrote
Yeah.
orthodoxy.
Yeah.
He had a conversion. So therefore, let's leave sort of these artistic questions almost untouched, and that can only do harm.
Right.
So yeah, I mean, I think that there's a long prejudice that says that if you're serious, this is actually returning to your opening remarks, but
Mm.
if you're serious about your faith and if you are dogmatically committed, you will become a bad artist, because you can't honestly and completely explore all of these tensions. Now, the truth is, of course, that the novel as a form, or fiction as a whole, or poetry, allows us to explore in an as if kind of hypothetical way all types of voices and tensions and questions that we flatly would disagree with outside of the fictional world, but that we are allowing ourselves to enter into, right? And with hospitality to entertain for, let's say, 300 pages. That doesn't mean that we're going to change our religion at the end of it, but we will enter with greater sympathy and complexity into those things insofar as we're reading or writing through those characters, and we have to do so excellently. So when I founded the MFA with James Matthew Wilson, who's the director, um, my main mission and aim is to give the lie to this idea that sanctity and artistic excellence cannot coexist, right?
Yeah.
So there's this long-standing sense that you have to be a sinner in a sort of ongoing way in order to
Mm.
write good fiction. If you start moving towards sanctity, or if you have a conversion, then your literature is going to suffer, because in
Mm.
order to write good literature, you have to have that sort of nitty-gritty, contact with the underbelly of reality, and it has to be sort of experiential and ongoing. Now, my counter argument would be that most of us have, even saints,
Yeah.
have sinned
Yeah.
plenty, and in fact, they know their sins better than any of us,
Absolutely.
and so they're not oblivious to, or they're not fooled
Yeah.
about their relationship to God or their own lowliness, right? In Francois Mauriac's essay God and Mammon, he says that when he read the lives of the saints, they seemed kind of perverse to him, because they would
Yeah.
say, "Oh, I'm
Yeah.
the worst person," right? These people are at the height of perfection in the Catholic faith,
Yeah.
and yet they're the worst, right?
Yeah.
So, but then he came to conclude that as saints advance in the double knowledge of God and of their own souls, they get such a piercing vision of their unworthiness that they
Mm.
abase themselves and they annihilate themselves by the most natural of instincts. And so, growing out of this, I think that it is absolutely essential that the artist pursues sanctity, because there are frequencies of reality, there are unseen aspects of reality that cannot be touched by the natural mind or man alone, right? Grace is absolutely necessary for our access to these things, even if we're only portraying them in hints and
Mm.
whispers.
Mm.
And so he said, Morak's conclusion was that there is this overlap between the pursuit of the saint and the pursuit of the novelist, because it's only the saint who could do what he says the novelist should do, which is this: if there is a reason for the fiction writer on earth, it is to show the element which holds out against God in the highest and noblest character. So, in other words, what parts of even the most virtuous person are kind of still closed off to God.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then it is also the job of the fiction writer or the artist to see that even in the most apparently wicked character, that there is some sort of secret source of sanctity
Yes.
that has so far failed, but that could potentially be tapped.
It's beautiful. Beautiful. It's like Solzhenitsyn. I mean, the line drawn through the human heart, as opposed to between nations and states and
And,
so on.
yeah,
It's
and, and
right.
and absolutely, and that's what the novel. See, that's what fiction gives us as a gift. Think you and I think could think honestly about many lives of the saints that just read like these kind of one-dimensional flat character
Yep.
portrayals,
Yep.
where it's just
Yep.
like, the saint, surely the saint, him or herself, was incredible, and if you spent 2 seconds with that saint, it would be life-changing. But you read this hagiography of the saint, and you feel like you're drinking sort of really bad
Yeah.
rose water,
Yep. Yes.
that is just sort of saccharine and sentimental. And the novel actually grew out in part of a sort of dissatisfaction with that kind of oversimplified one dimensionality.
Yeah.
And the desire instead was to say, exactly, we're doing away with villain over here, hero over here, and we're
Yes.
saying, villain and hero conjoined in every human person.
Yeah.
So,
It's great. It's just great. Okay, so we just talked about the notion of first being an excellent novelist, excellent writer, and then yes, letting your Catholic sensibility inform your craft, but being excellent at your craft. But now I want to take it to the other side and say, Joshua, what role does your work have in evangelizing the culture? What's your sense about the books that are coming out of Wise Blood books? What's your sense about the role that they have in moving the needle in people's individual interior lives vis-a-vis their relationship with God?
yeah, I mean, I just recently read a review of Sally Thomas's novel Works of Mercy, which came out last year, and it was a reflection on spiritual motherhood. So the protagonist of that novel, Kirsty Sane, is a sort of a widower. She says she was a better widower than she was a wife. Um, she's kind of cleaning the rectory, cleaning the church, but keeping very much to herself.
Mm.
And in the middle of this attempt to be sort of severed from everyone else around her while also supposedly doing something good for the church, she encounters both a young priest who's very much untried and is in need of her spiritual motherhood,
Mm.
and also a family with many, many children that is very dysfunctional to the point that there's a death in the family with one of the children, right? And in the midst of this kind of chaos in this other family's life and in the priest's life, the protagonist, Kirsty Sane, realizes that she's been called to be a spiritual mother. And so this essay drew this out, the thesis that I'm relating to you about spiritual motherhood. I don't think that I even really originally saw that in there. This is a story about a woman who has a transformation, but I wouldn't necessarily have framed it as such.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that there's an example of a reader whose interior life was the needle was moved in the right
Yeah.
direction significantly for the better. And then that same reader reflected upon it and wrote an essay that could invite other people to read the novel, so that that sense of the call that all women have, she says, to spiritual motherhood, even if you are not a biological mother, um, is something that will be compelling, because you'll pass through what that can look like incarnationally in the life
Mm.
of that protagonist, right? So we all know that that Jesus told stories, Jesus used parables, and that's sort of an overused justification for why story is so important. But I mean, it's obviously the best
Yeah.
justification,
Yeah.
and the reason that he did that is because those parables invited people into temporary irresolution of a question or problem that they thought that they had down pat, right? Oh, yep, got this one solved,
Yeah.
right? There are the sinners over here and the saints over here. Oh, there are the Samaritans over here, the true Israelites over here. Got that fixed, right? And then Jesus tells the parable and it explodes those neat categories. And what the reason that parable does that is because it invites you into a mystery, right?
Mm.
You say, how can these two things go together? They don't seem like they can. And it activates the mind into
Yeah.
doing work alongside the story. And by extension, that's the strength of all poetry and fiction, is that it invites people into mystery, and it brings them into a level of existence that maybe they had relegated to the cellar of their soul, right? Like sort of
Mm.
I
Mm.
have room for the idea that God might be out there in the basement, in the coal room of the basement, for example, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
But I've compartmentalized and I've shut it off. So I think that the work that Wiseblood is publishing, the work that's coming out of the MFA, and I hope some of my own work, is trying to, again, take what has been relegated to the basement, and eventually at some point in the poem or the story allow it to become what is most central and most essential, but it has to happen in a sort of very believable, compelling, and natural way. It has to grow out of the action of a story. As I tell my students, you don't start with a theological idea like grace or something. You
Mm.
start with what um, what are this particular character? Does he like coffee or tea? What kind of shoes does he wear?
Sure.
Is his shoes are his shoes oftentimes coming untied because he doesn't know how to tie them? Get those things right first, right? Is he the kind of person who, if someone asks him for something, he'll shut down and begrudgingly do it, or is he the kind of person who, when you ask him for something, he'll drop everything immediately and do it,
Yeah.
right? Though
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
answer, you put together those kinds of questions first as an artist, and then you say, okay, given these particulars of this kind of person, what would it look like for grace to act upon
Mm.
his nature?
Yeah.
And then you try to work that out, right, in a probable way.
Yeah.
You don't do the reverse, right, which is just sort of like, oh, I'm going to start with the theological idea of conversion,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
then I'm going to plug in these sort of these names or something and give them. Oh, I'll give them a mustache, by the way, right? So
Yeah.
uh, it has to be right, sort of just like Jesus is both God and fully man. It has good work of art has to be fully natural and fully spiritual.
Yeah. That's so good, and I think it does get to the notion of the difference between theory and practice, and I think that what you've just said is, even outside of the parables of Jesus' parables, you look at the figures in the Bible that are at the the foundation of our church. Peter, I mean, as an example of, here's a guy who was kind of a strong-headed bull, and he was very courageous at times, and he was spot on at some times, and he was wrong at other times. I mean, you can just you get to, without even understanding the nuances of love your neighbor as yourself, and the parable of the Good Samaritan, and so on and so forth. You're watching what Peter does, how he reacts, and just watching his life, and then you see, kind of superimposed on his life are the spiritual truths that are dawning upon him, the way he becomes a leader, the way he becomes selfless, the times when he's so far along and then he totally backslides. You were the rock, and then get behind me, Satan. I mean, it was a bad day. I mean, so it's amazing to what your point is that, there's one thing and this is getting back, and I'm not trying to sound cliche about this, but it's one thing to tell somebody they should or should not do something or other. It's another to tell them a story that
Yeah,
embodies that. And whether you ever come back and say, and that's why at the end of Aesop's
yeah,
fable, the moral of the story is this. You don't even say that. That's why what I'm reading out of Wise Bud books, so much of it leaves certain things hanging there, and organically percolating through me, not just the first time I read it, but it's revived, and even revived in a different way the second or the third time I read it down the road. It's sort of, it's tilling the soil, and then
yes,
letting the sun and the rain and the seeds and the wind basically bring what it may onto that ground. And it's to my way of thinking, it's an ingenious way, instead of having a bat hit it against someone's head, it's an ingenious way of bringing Christ to the culture.
and I mean, it's also doing that in a way that is very much caught up with just kind of everydayness. So we
Yeah.
talk about the works of mercy. Most of what the work of fiction covers is just sort of everyday reality for relatively ordinary people, right? Which, upon second glance, lo and behold, you find that they're actually extraordinary, many of them, right? So that's the whole
Yeah.
thing about what fiction does. And it's fascinating that you bring up St. Peter, because in his book Mimesis, Eric Auerbach says that actually it is in the Gospels that everyday reality is treated seriously for the first time in literature. Now, Auerbach is reading the Gospels not as a sacred text, but just as literature. But what he sees is that, right, in the ancient world, a person like Peter would never have been treated seriously
Yeah.
in ancient literature, because he would have been, if you treat a low class member of society, you treat them comically, and that's
Yeah.
it. That's
Yeah.
all they get, right? They can come up on stage to make everybody laugh, to do a stupid dance, and then they're gone. But in the gospel, Auerbach says, Peter undergoes, as you said, a tremendous pendulation. The
Mm,
pendulum swings back and
mm.
forth all the time.
Yep.
Everything is at stake. He is a world historical figure, and he's a fisherman, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so much of that requires just a sort of days and days of reflection. Just that fact that the Gospels as a genre, so to speak, opened up everyday reality and allowed us to treat it seriously, and by extension, open up the way for fiction to do that as
Mm.
well. And so it's not necessarily about, even if you think about a work like um, Moby Dick, for example, right? There's Ahab, who is definitely an
Yeah,
extraordinarily
yeah.
tyrannical figure,
Mm.
but the story is told by Ishmael, who's not quite so extraordinary. He's much more familiar. He's kind of not quite committed, and he's an observer, but he's also guilty, right? So I could go on with many other examples, but just
Yeah.
the point is that we could multiply the instances where, again, there's this exploration of the pendulum swinging from the grave danger to a particular soul to great salvation, and it all happens in the living room of someone's house,
It's
right?
amazing.
It doesn't have to happen on a grand battlefield or
Yes.
on the political stage of the country. It can happen in an apartment in the Midwest.
This is a little bit of what Tolstoy says, and Gary Saul Morrison at Northwestern speaks about this, about
Yeah,
that again, the world is moved or changed not by clashes and armies and battles, but by the little bits, the infinitesimal little bits in people's lives that are imperceptible, but they're seismic in their ultimate change as you move along. And I guess part of our problem nowadays is we're a very impatient, very distracted, oftentimes undiscerning culture that doesn't have time for the little bits, and yet in the end there they are, right?
that's absolutely right. And so, for people who would say, well, why continue to be committed to fiction, to both the craft and the art of it, and publishing it and teaching it in a time when, for example, film and Twitter are sort of taking over everything. My my response to that is this: I was told several years ago by an education specialist during an in-service that if we wanted to reach our students, we had to break all of our lessons down into 8-second sound bites. And I just asked the person if they could help me figure out how to do an 8-second Iliad, right? And I went to my students and I actually said, this is, do you realize what people are saying about you? I don't want to believe it.
Oh,
People are saying that you do not have the capacity to read more than 8 seconds at a time. Is that true?
good one.
And I would like you to prove to me that that is not true.
Yeah,
And if it is the case, then the purpose of this class is to redress that, right? So,
yeah,
I mean, there's two possible
yeah.
responses, right? You say, well, either you give up, throw your hands up, and then you've completely dashed against the rocks this tremendous vessel of exploration of complexity, right? And
Mm.
you allow people to settle for and capitulate to a much more superficial mediums, or you say which is the work of teachers. That's the work of teachers, not of artists, right? The artist can't go out and say, I'm going to teach you I'm going to teach people how to read. So this is something that has to be sort of addressed on multiple levels at the same time, right? It's not as though great books or good books can show up on someone's doorstep and then automatically someone's going to be receptive
Yeah.
because there's a storehouse of wisdom in there. And the same thing goes for your point about the patience that's required. And I feel that tension all the time. I spend time on social media for Wisebud Books pretty much every day out of an obligation, of sense of need to promote. And when you're in that kind of economy, you do begin to feel what's the point of
Yeah.
these sort of deep dives? It's so at odds with where everyone is right now that it seems pointless. But then you remember what George Eliot says about, right? It's in these frail vessels is born onward through the ages the treasure of human affection. And it
Mm.
is, you know, it's the visitation, it's the people whose graves are not visited, who
Yeah.
she says at the end of Middlemarch that we probably owe the most to develop and to continue on that great point that you were raising, that Tolstoy and Solzhenitsyn, or Gary Saul Morrison, I think you're saying,
Hmm. Hmm. Hmm.
raised. And that's absolutely true. That's not just a sort of, excessively egalitarian or demonic desire or democratic desire, excuse me,
Hmm. Hmm.
to elevate sort of the insignificant to significance at any cost. It is just true. Anybody who reflect on our lives, or the role that your grandmother played in raising you, for example, and she gets no lauds, right? No
Yeah,
praise.
yeah,
No one
yeah,
remembers her, right?
yeah,
We all know that to be true. I
yeah.
think so. Literature just helps us to remember it better.
Well said. Joshua, I could ask you so many more questions, but I know your time is short, and so I wanted to ask you one last question, and that is, how have you been personally changed by your calling, both as a writer and a publisher?
Yeah, so it's been an incredible gift. I cannot believe that I get to do all the kinds of work that I'm able to do as a publisher. I've been brought into contact with amazing writers whose depth perception surpasses any that I will ever have. And so, being able to absorb and soak some of that up while working on their books, seeing their books brought to fruition under, our mutual collaboration, editorial collaboration, has brought, endless joy to me. Watching Wise Blood find its footing and sort of actually be able to establish reputation proves to me St. Paul's point that God's power is made perfect in our weakness. I have a lot of health problems. So I have chronic Lyme disease, among a number of
Mm,
other things. And so I'm actually bedbound regularly, at least weekly. And the truth is, if I could, which I won't, do a kind of confessional to reveal what goes on behind the scenes, none of this should have happened. The
mm,
PhD should not have happened. Wisewood book should not have happened. None of the books that I wrote should have been finished. And I know that as an absolute truth. And so, because these things happened, it is proof, it is absolute testimony of God's grace. And so, I guess the my main answer is that it has changed me because it's all of this has been evidence in abundance of the operations of God's providence.
mm. Dr. Joshua Hren, writer, publisher, and brilliant stoker of the fires of the Catholic literary tradition. Thank you, Joshua. It's been just a wonderful pleasure talking with you.
Oh, thank you so much, Todd. Thanks be to God.
So I've been thinking, life is complex, and earnest literature attempts to unpack and grapple with that complexity. Now, to be sure, there's something refreshing found in the simple, tight narrative arc of a fairy tale or one of Aesop's fables. If you do this, there is that consequence, or if you do that, there is this consequence. Cause and effect, good guys and bad, right and wrong. But before long, we start to realize that there is a lot more complexity to life than initially meets the eye. Life just ain't that simple. There's more hedging and wavering, uncertainty and indecision. Life, notwithstanding its area of black and whites, can vex us with its circumstantial shades of gray. As a child, I believed the world was comprised of order with a little superimposed chaos. Now, in my graying years, I have come to understand that in truth, there is a whole lot more chaos with select smatterings of order. Life indeed is complex. And that is why I love literature that reflects that gritty reality. Now, in saying this, I must confess that some authors have gotten the wrong idea when they strive to offer, quote, reality. They believe that an authentic representation of life in its complexity means a celebration of the crude, the base, even the disgusting. I liken this to comedians whose act is little more than resort to shocking vulgarity to get a laugh. It's lazy, off putting, and in fact, boring. Gritty reality is so much more interesting. It is embodied in Raskolnikov's paranoia and Elizabeth Bennet's pride, Odysseus's homesickness and Scrooge's stubbornness, Hamlet's vacillation and Dante's fear. Even though the greatest of authors grant us a glimpse into their characters' souls, it is always an incomplete look. There are always lengthening shadows and unexplored corners. There are irrationalities and inconsistencies, imperfections and uncertainties. Comfortable assurances dissolve into a spectral mist, figures with soaring vision encumbered with clay feet. Samuel Johnson both celebrates and laments how faithful Shakespeare's creations are to human life. Shakespeare, he writes, opens a mine which contains gold and diamonds in unexhaustible plenty, though clouded by incrustations, debased by impurities, and mingled with a mass of meaner minerals. Solzhenitsyn learned this truth about human nature after years in the Soviet Gulag when he wrote, quote, "Gradually, it was disclosed to me that the line separating good and evil passes not through states, nor between classes, nor between political parties either, but right through every human heart, and through all human hearts. This line shifts. Inside us, it oscillates with the years." One may understand the cosmos, G.K. Chesterton noted, but never the ego. The self is more distant than any star. And that is as it should be. After all, aren't we tired of pat answers and glib certainties about what is truly unfathomable in us? Harkening back to the poem When I Heard the Learned Astronomer, aren't we like Walt Whitman's tired and sick audience member who despairs of the astronomer's perfect figures and proofs, charts and diagrams, hoping only to escape the lecture hall to emerge in the mystical, moist night air and look up in perfect silence at the stars? Honest literature, to borrow from Thomas Merton, allows us to find ourselves and lose ourselves at the same time. Long live the honest and well-written word. And one last thing. For this week's book, I would heartily recommend Josh Hren's Contemplative Realism, a theological aesthetical manifesto. This thoughtful and brief consideration explores the mindset that Joshua brings to his writing, editing, and publishing, one that simultaneously calls for a wedding of gritty reality with our divine origins and God-kissed nature. It is a plea for abandoning the stunted self and reclaiming in literature the totality of what it means to be human. Thank you for listening to the Evangelization and Culture podcast. Please be sure to subscribe to Word on Fire's YouTube channel, leave a review, and share with your friends. And don't forget to get a free copy of Word on Fire's award-winning journal, Evangelization and Culture, at wordonfire.org/journal. Until next time, I'm Todd Warner. Please keep proclaiming Christ to a hungry culture.